Συναντήσαμε τον κύριο Jooste, αναλυτή της Merrill Lynch, κατά την παρουσίαση των προβλέψεων του οίκου για το 2012. Ας δούμε τι μας απάντησε για τις προοπτικές των ευρωπαϊκών τραπεζών το νέο έτος βάσει των προβλέψεων της Merrill Lynch για υψηλό ρίσκο και χαμηλές αποδόσεις.
If we're talking about banks as sort of an equity investment, I think the environment for them is well challenging in the sense that they face regulatory issues in terms of additional capital that they have to start raising to comply with the new regulations Basel III. Now, if things go sufficiently badly in markets, you would expect the regulators to have some forbearance, in other words, to be quite relaxed about the speed at which that capital that they require is raised. Nonetheless, that's an overhang. So from an equity investor's point of view, basically the capital base has to be increased, and we would think that in the long run that reduces, not increases, expected returns. Return on equity should be somewhat lower. From the point of view of a bond investor, it might be a different story, and we've already seen the first week or so of this year and the last 2-3 weeks a decoupling in US banks between how the debt prices compared to how other sectors of the market prices general risk, equity risk. That is to say, the debt has started to perform a little bit better as the market digests the fact that a larger amount of equity might make your bonds a little bit safer. Now, we're not at that point yet for European banks because they still have to raise the equity. So in the case of European banks, they might have to raise equity, they might have to sell assets. In an extreme environment like we've seen in Ireland, you might have the government have to step in. Likewise, in the UK, 2 banks have got very large government participation in the equity of the balance sheet. So those are all of the options on the table. So for this year, tough environment for banks, basically.
Ας δούμε τώρα ποιες είναι οι εκτιμήσεις του κυρίου Jooste για το αν οι ευρωπαϊκές τράπεζες έχουν βρει τον λεγόμενο πάτο.
I think we're getting closer to. I think a lot depends obviously on how the recapitalization plays itself out. But I think the market has gotten to the point where it's discounting a very large proportion of what can potentially still go wrong. That is to say, what things can go wrong is that the raising of equity happens at a very discounted level and it reduces the book value. Equally, that you have to sell assets at a discounted level. The market has been very suspicious of the valuations that some banks carry some of their assets, especially in the property sector, for example. But it's difficult to imagine that the majority of that has not been priced. It's probably priced sort of roughly at sort of a fair level, but the volatility around that is going to be quite high. In other words, you can have large deviations on a specific basis. So some banks might be a lot better, some might be a lot worse. So part of the reason for being a little bit cautious of having exposure there is really the expected volatility as much as anything else. And given that there are opportunities in the market that present you with roughly the same sort of a return expectation with a lot less volatility. So we're just concentrating on those and waiting for the banking sector to sort itself out before. But you are right, the sector is not expensive.
Τι θα γίνει με την Ευρωπαϊκή Κεντρική Τράπεζα, θα ακολουθήσει τον δρόμο της Fed ή της BOE στην ποσοτική χαλάρωση? Ο κύριος Jooste απαντά.
I think your first point is valid. I think they will lower rates. I think the way that you have to think about the progression towards quantitative easing is that the first step is you must have conventional policy as accommodative as possible. In other words, effectively zero rates, and they're still some way off that. So they can lower rates once or twice more before they even have to consider QE, just in a normalized sort of framework. I honestly think that if they do QE, it will be on their terms. In other words, it won't look necessarily like we've seen it elsewhere. It might be with, let's say, a quasi type of partnership with the banking sector, like we've seen with the 3-year, might get stretched out, or something of this sort of nature. So it will look not identical to anything else. But I think the first step is that they do have to lower rates in response to the very weak growth outlook and the fact that surely inflation is not a risk for this year or next year, and that they have the scope to take rates as low as they can. At that point, to add additional stimulus to the economy, then they have to start thinking quantitatively. How they're going to implement that, I think they have loads of options. A bit difficult to predict which one they're going to come up with.
Ας δούμε τώρα αν, σύμφωνα με τον κύριο Jooste, η ποσοτική χαλάρωση, όπως και αν αυτή γίνει, αποτελεί λύση για την κρίση.
Well, it's worked on a temporary basis, certainly fairly well, I would suggest, in the US. The jury is out whether it's really done a huge amount in the UK. But what it does do is it provides a large amount of liquidity into the system at a time when the monetary transmission mechanism is under severe pressure. In other words, sort of normal monetary policy doesn't really work so well. So it's a surrogate for that. But there's no long-term solution other than just growing, getting the economy to grow again. And what this does, it provides something of a buffer, an extended period, if you like, of healing for the economy that would not have been there otherwise. So from that point of view, it's a tool to achieving something, but it's not the achievement in itself.
Τέλος, ο κύριος Jooste αναλύει τα αρνητικά και τα θετικά σενάρια για το 2012.
I think the main thing is around policy, so positive and negative. So I think on the negative side is that there's a failure in Europe. And I think that would be something wider than just something going wrong in Greece. In other words, we have a more systemic issue around Spain and Italy as well, and something of a, let's say, a sort of a failure to address the issues around, say, the overall monetary mechanism, how that works, and say the fiscal program of austerity across the region, and how that basically gets done in terms of treaty changes and something of that sort of. So in other words, a broader issue than just sort of Greece and PSI, which is fairly isolated. That's the downside. I think upside is that positioning in the market is exceedingly defensive. Whole lots of bad news priced in, and if there's just one or two small positive surprises, we can really see markets run quite quickly. The banks we've already spoken about, so people like me very depressed about it. And if there's just a slight loosening in policy, suddenly banks can really rally, and if they do, everything else follows just on some good news. So I think the market is positioned overly defensively, possibly, and you might have a real run just on the basis of, let's say, slight surprise out of Europe. It gets done a little bit quicker. One thing we think possibly, if there's a surprise upside, good news out of the US housing market, and possibly even China. If China suddenly goes on a spurt again on the back of some of the monetary policy easing. So I think it's sort of finely balanced. And I think the main upside risk to markets is that there's too much pessimism potentially priced in. And then some of that pessimism gets sort of priced out. It can move quickly.